Welcome to Our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn. I'm your host for this series, and today we're going to discuss a topic that's very important to northeastern Kentucky. We're going to discuss the logging practices in eastern Kentucky over the years. And in talking of early logging practices in this area, particularly the mountain terrain, it's good to have as our guest Mr. C.L. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong's been a friend of mine for about 4 or 5 years now, and I've come to respect his knowledge of mountain logging, of a great number of mechanical and technical things. I will refer to you as Mr. Armstrong, Booge, but I'll tell them that a lot of people in Morehead call you Booge. You want to tell us how in the world you got a nickname like that?
Well, my grandfather was a moonshiner, and the high sheriff in the county, which was Menifee County, where he done his moonshine, was named Booger Wells. And when he came to see me when I was little, and I tried to raise my head up, he said, "Look at him just like Booger Wells trying to see in everybody's business." And the name stuck.
Well, of course, you went on to do a great deal of timber work, sawmilling, at a fairly young age. You tell me you were born in 1920 in Rowan County. And what part of the county were you actually born in, Mr. Armstrong?
I was born in Clay Lick in the southern part of Rowan.
And a lot of that area is flooded out now and part of the Cave Run Reservoir,
Yes,
I guess.
Most of all the flat land is.
Mm-hmm. Now, didn't you tell me that your father was also in the timber business in part, as was your grandfather? So it's a long-term proposition for the Armstrong family.
It'd been a thing for as long as I could remember, sawmills and talking about timber, and as long as I can remember. My grandfather had a country grocery store, blacksmith shop, the sawmill, and grist mill.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I guess I've just raised up with it, as far as I know.
When do you first remember, though, working at cutting timber in earnest? What age were you?
Well, I started working at a sawmill when I was 14 and a half.
Mm-hmm.
As far as getting paid, I was around before then. And my dad and my grandfather, one time I remember before then that most of the time the mill wouldn't be right close to home, and well, what's called Raglan oil fields. This is in Bath County.
Mm-hmm.
Had a mill there, and of course I heard them talk about the sawmills blowing up and everything. And it was right at the time the oil boom was going on there in Raglan. Mm-hmm. And it had this sawmill sitting right in amongst all these oil wells. Of course, at that time all the source of power was steam or water power, and this was a steam mill, and a guy comes with a 5-gallon bucket of crude oil and puts in the boiler, and the black smoke just rolled and covered everything all around. You couldn't see, and by the time they got me stopped, I was halfway up a hill. I thought it was ready to blow up.
That was your introduction to using oil for making steam, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about early mountain logging. And of course, you've seen a great deal change with regard to the way trees are cut down, the way they're milled, and of course the way finished lumber is made. This has always been an area where we've produced a lot of logs, but we really haven't carried it too far to a finished stage. Tell us about a typical logging job, say in the 30s or the 40s, and we're talking about a period before chainsaws had been developed. So explain to us how you would tackle a parcel of woods and harvest them during, say, the 30s or 40s.
Well, of course, about the time that I first started, big logging had done gone out, and it's back to the big mills was gone, and there's all gone back to the small mill, and more of the logging was done with teams.
You mean now by
and,
teams of mules?
Yeah, teams of mules, and of course floated down rivers, rafted, and some just turned in and picked up by booms where there was mills. When I was a small boy, there was a large mill at Farmers and Salt Lick that both used log booms to stop logs that floated down Licking River. Then sometimes they would put enough together to make rafts and ride them down when during high tides.
Mm-hmm. But tell me about cutting trees with the crosscut saw. Now, a lot of the people listening to us today may have not seen a crosscut saw, but basically it's a huge saw blade with a handle on either end, and it took two men, I guess, to work that saw. But was it a pretty efficient way of cutting logs? In other words, for a long time, did it seem to serve the purpose of keeping sawmills busy?
I imagine it served the purpose for quite a few years. It's similar to what the Chinese used thousands of years ago with a whip saw and all that.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost the same thing, only just made for a cross cut instead of a rip.
Mm-hmm.
Steel is just a good high carbon grade of steel and can be fixed a little, really cut. We had several different patterns. The two most popular patterns in this area would have been the two-cutter and the four-cutter. The two-cutter was more used in softwood and the four-cutter in hardwood.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say that the main power to drag logs once they'd been cut, out to the river or to the sawmill was mule teams. Why did they use mules as opposed to horses?
Well, of course, I guess they had more mules than anything else. I mean, they didn't. They kept horses, but they was more or less to ride. The mule was counted the best worker and the safest.
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't come as nigh getting himself hurt. He'd stand up on the rougher ground and everything, and a horse could. Of course, every farmer and everybody had mules, had to have them to farm.
Mm-hmm.
So it was good logger, and probably as far as today, with all the modern equipment, as far as what would be good for the forest, it'd be maybe good to go back to the mule,
mm-hmm.
for they don't do as much tearing up as equipment, machinery.
Right. Is a mule as smart as a horse, though, in working logs?
Well, a mule is smarter than a horse in being taught to work in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever know of people using oxen in this part of the country, or did that go back further than your...
Well, I've heard, of course, a lot of talk of my grandfather and other older people talk about logging with ox teams, but I've only saw it one time, and that was it's close to Jackson, Kentucky, on quicksand, on the part of the land that now belongs to Kentucky University in Robinson Forest.
Mm-hmm.
I can't. It's been somewhere around 35 years anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the guy was just trying it as a novelty. I think he went broke a logging.
So oxen must not have worked out too well.
Too slow. They could pull a good sized load, but they're slow.
You've told me before, Mr. Armstrong, that you helped to introduce chainsaws to this country in the 40s. And a lot of folks don't realize that it was a matter of cross-cut saws, it was a matter of mule teams, it was a matter of skidding logs any way you could, with flumes or down the river or whatever for many, many years. But what was the initial resistance to chainsaws? Of course, they weren't invented until, I guess, the 30s or maybe early 40s, but you tell me that people weren't that excited about chainsaws early on.
Well, they probably was excited when they first come out, but when they bought one and it'd go wrong and they couldn't keep it running, and they finally got disgusted with them and just set them aside, and they wouldn't hardly just quit buying them.
Mm-hmm. So there were troubles with chainsaws.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, as far as their...
They was too heavy. They might have been working in, as we call it down south, the flatlands or somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't for these mountains. Something that weigh 100 pounds or more to get up and down the mountains with. Some places are steep enough that a man does well just get himself, let alone take 100 pounds.
That's true. You, though, are one of the earliest home-light saw dealers in this entire nation. Tell me the tale you've told me before about the salesman from New York talking you into becoming a home-light salesman.
Well, this salesman comes along and wants me to sell chainsaws, and I'd done bought one, and I'd set it back. I'd spent about maybe $1,700 and for parts and everything, and the saw the original cost of the saw, and cut about 40,000 feet, and I give up, went back to the crosscuts, and this Yankee comes along wanting to sell these chainsaws, and I told him I wasn't interested. Well, he kept a-talking, and finally got me to agree to go to the logwoods, take him to the logwoods where I had the best cross cutters a-cutting, and he said he would take a saw and he'd cut as much as both of them did, the 4 men. So we got worked a half a day, and of course he beat them, and I started selling saws. But at the time, it wasn't the first company. As far as I know, maybe the Maul chainsaw was the first to hit this area, then the McCullough, Lombard, and Homelite. Homelite is not as old a company as some of the others, but it was a top seller in the world. I don't know for sure right now.
Mm-hmm. Of course, nowadays people can't even imagine logging without chainsaws. We take them so much for granted, but a lot of other things it's hard to imagine. Now, when I think of loggers riding rafts of logs out riverways, I, of course, think of the far west, the northwest particularly, but it's interesting for me to hear of tales of loggers riding rafts down the Licking River. And you say that in the early part of this century that was quite common, something that you heard about from your dad. And
yes, I saw some of it. My dad has run rafts. He also run a sawmill, and he'd cut ties, and I know of him rafting them from clay licked farmers.
How did they get logs then down into the river, and what times of year could you actually float them out? Licking's not a very wide river.
Well, of course, in some of the, I guess you'd call canyons like there is in the Blackwater area, and that's where it flows into the lake. They use splash dams, which is kind of a crude-made coffee dam. Then when it'd come a big rain, it would fill up with water. Of course, they already had the logs rolled in, and they'd dynamite that dam, and that'd take them out of this rough place.
Okay, you mean now by
the creek.
A splash dam would be to temporarily hold the water to build up a big reservoir. Right. When they got enough water, they would actually blow it apart, and that would create, I guess, a flash flood.
Yeah,
almost.
They just wash them out. Of course, there's never enough water in those small canyons like for a log to float out. But they could save up, build it up with the dam till it'd float them out all at one time.
Would there be several sawmills then all along the river? How in the world did they know their logs and pull them out?
Well, one time when the river was used more or less for the transportation of the logs, they'd all have log buyers. The different sawmills be on the river. Of course, there was one above Farmers, what's called Yale well, it's under the place under the lake now with the village there. It had a big sawmill one time, and they would brand the logs, buy them from maybe a farmer most of the time when he got his farming done, and generally in the wintertime is when he would do his logging, when he could get the logs out when the snow was on the ground, or when the ground be froze, they could be snaked out easier with his team of mules or whatever what he used.
Mm-hmm.
But the guy do the buying, he would brand the log over which company he was buying for, and they would roll it in. They may let them lay there for a while, let them not put them in the river right off, let them lay a while, and to let them dry just a little bit. Some logs won't float unless they've got a few days of sunshine on them after they've been cut.
Now, when you speak of branding logs, you mean literally a branding iron, like you?
It's like a branding hammer, be like a hammer, only it's engraved to have a name, and you just hit it on the end.
Okay, they wouldn't use heat with it. You just make the imprint of the company.
No, it just make an imprint. Of course, they brand them on both ends most of the time if they can get to them.
So was it a matter of people honoring the brand of another company? Did they pretty well know the brand of different companies?
As far as I know, I've listened to my grandfather and several people years ago that they must have had a right smart honor amongst the sawmillers at that time, for they kept their, if one of them got the other fellow's logs, he'd go ahead and pay for them. He said they never had no problems with the ownership after they put them in the river.
Now, they would have a boom, I guess, there at the mill. In other words, something to slow down the logs.
Yeah, they would use a boom. They generally put in kind of a coffee dam to make a pond like, and slow the current down in the river. Then they'd use high floaters with a chain and make a boom that they could catch the logs as they come in.
You were speaking early on about the big logging being over when you were a boy. Now, by that, I guess you mean the major companies that came in here and cut out virgin forest were cutting out huge timbers for the first time ever. Were there still tracts of good-sized trees since you've been logging, or was most all the virgin timber cut?
There are very few places that they didn't get some out of. Of course, the walnut and the white oak is like during World War I, the white oak, they were still using it in ship timbers. And they've combed this country for good white oak and took it all out, all the big white oak.
But they were cutting very selectively at some points in the past.
That was all was worth getting out at the time, I guess. It was the only thing they had a market for. Of course, I've found just occasionally some place where it'd be in a rough place it couldn't be got out or something. You'd find some, it hadn't been anything cut out of it, but of course, the timber only lasts so long anyway, and you see where a lot of big trees had fell and decayed.
What's some of the biggest timber you've gotten into, though? Have you cut some large trees in years past, or tracts where there were a lot of large trees?
I have cut some 4 foot, some little over 4 foot, through. I've hauled just one log on a truck several times.
But when you talk about 4 feet or so across the base of the tree, you're talking about a good-sized piece of timber.
Well, that's a good-sized tree for us today.
What species are we really harvesting these days in the mountains, and what species have the mountains been known for over the years?
Well, of course, in this area, of course, was probably our highest species, brought the most money, has been black walnut. Then, of course, now our oaks are going pretty good, especially the red oak. White oak is kindly slowed down. Of course, as far as our commercial timber in this area, probably the most right now is in the oak. We have quite a bit of oak, maybe more than anything else. We don't have too much in pine. We worked it pretty hard years ago to build houses out of. We had a market for it. We didn't have no market for oak. For quite a few years, the only market there was for oak was in the cross ties.
Mm-hmm.
Then got down now till we finally got the women interested in looking at a piece of oak furniture. They go, of course, it goes through periods of time, maybe cycles. Right now, the oak is pretty well out front, especially the red oak. I more or less credit it to the antique pieces that they'd buy, and they could, if they got something was made out of oak, they could always redo it and it looked good. And so the women got to like oak, and a lot of them were interior decorators. When they had the big machine shows, they go and they look at it, and ever what they like, that's what us sawmillers are going to sell.
That's the way it goes.
For the balance of that year.
Right. When you were a young man, were there chestnut trees left in this area, or had the blight got them all?
No, when I was young, they were still, the chestnut was all left here, and the blight hadn't started. I can remember when it hadn't started. It had more or less was coming kind of south from the southeast direction, coming this way, northwest, I'd say. It kind of traveled. I gathered quite a few chestnuts. I used to gather them, and my dad would bring them in town and sell them. I don't know just when that. I can't remember just when I first noticed them dying. I remember when they was talking about what was happening. Of course, they seemed to grow in kind of groves, like it'd be a whole lot of them. You know, they just probably kill out all the other species because they was fast-growing timber when they got started.
You know, I think I'll get on a bit of a personal note, because many of our viewers may not realize, Mr. Armstrong, that you are a very prominent businessman in Morehead, Kentucky. In fact, you are sole owner or partial owner of several companies. The Homer Gregory Lumber Company, which you own, the Clearfield Lumber Company, which has basically been involved in drying timber, and then, of course, you have been a part owner, the major owner, in fact, of Kentucky Saws. So you've had a very large business operation. Now, a lot of our viewers probably realize that Mr. Armstrong's businesses were dealt a severe blow a few weeks back when a major fire burned down much of your holdings. I would say a couple of $1 million in assets were lost. Tell me, what does that do to a man after he's spent many, many years trying to build up a business? Has this happened to you before, or is this the first disaster that's come your way?
No, it seems like I've kind of begun to get used to it. I have always had disasters in business, just as long as it's not doesn't get nobody's hurt or anything. It's not really so bad. I always just don't think about what's happened. I think about what I can do to offset it, or how can I get it back.
Right. You've had businesses that have been burned out and flooded out before, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
So you are accustomed to starting over, and obviously of making a big success at it. What are your plans at this point? Do you hope to rebuild your businesses, or is that looking difficult to this point?
I'm hoping to. Of course, the most, really the thing right now is the interest rate, and you can't do it without borrowing money. Then you can't afford the borrowed money. You can't make that much money.
Right.
So
We've spent a lot of time kind of looking backward at some of the early practices in logging in this area, but what do you think the future holds for logging in this area? Is northeastern Kentucky still an area that has a great deal to benefit from the timber and sawmill industry? And how could we improve on it?
Well, it has. We have quite a bit of timberland, and it grows a lot faster than a lot of people thinks. Of course, they say we have more timber now than we did years ago. It may not look like it, but they may be right. I'm not, of course, you could take 10 little trees, it'd be maybe bigger than one big one, or it would grow more.
Right.
So I don't know, but I think if we're getting to be a little more conservative and know more about what we're doing. Of course, we've got the help of the U.S. Forest Service. We have the State Forest Service. The University of Kentucky has been a great help in this area, and the timber processing, and even in some of the techniques of logging.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Armstrong, I certainly want to thank you for being our guest today. We've been discussing with Mr. C.L. Armstrong early logging practices, and we want you to come back and visit us again sometime. Now I want to tell our audience that we've enjoyed having you on this segment of Our Appalachia. Do join us again. Thank you, Mr. Armstrong.
Well,